I'm the manager of education and visitor experience here at the Dorsky Museum. We are very, very excited to be joined today by the curators of the exhibition Dos Mundos, Reconstructing Narratives, Stephanie Lindquist and Juanita Lanzo. And also equally as excited to have three artists in the exhibition, Aaron Turner, Erika Morillo, and Antonio Pulgarin.
I'm Stephanie Lindquist, one of two co-curators with Juanita Lanzo, and we're so glad to be joined by our 3 of 12 artists today, Erika Morillo, Antonio Pulgarin, and Aaron Turner. And we'd also like to share our gratitude to Foco for producing the exhibition, and to the Samuel Dorsky Museum for exhibiting it. And I should say that this exhibition is traveling. So this is the first of 4 museums that are part of the State University of New York system. The second exhibit will be at SUNY Fredonia, and then at Binghamton, and then lastly at Stony Brook.
So this Dos Mundos Reconstructing Narratives is produced by Foco. Foco Inc. is a nonprofit that supports contemporary, primarily US-based photographers of African, Asian, Latino, Native American, and Pacific Islander heritage. It was created or founded in 1974, and they make their work visible to the art world. You know what, I'm just gonna paraphrase it, saying that it provides opportunities for photographers of color through exhibitions, workshops, and their publication Nueva Luz, which it's launched, released, or published 2 times a year. One of the issues highlights the work of the fellows from the Foco Photography Fellowship, and the other ones are artists, and sometimes, and many of the times, it revolves around a specific theme.
And they're really beautiful publications.
Oh, you have the catalog there.
Yeah, so I encourage you to go to the Foco website and get your hands on one. Really, really beautiful. And I believe it's the oldest and really one of a kind publication for photographers of color in the US. So it's really just like an indispensable resource for getting a sense of, getting a pulse of like, what are photographers of color doing right now. The fellowship, I encourage you to share this information with photographers of color that you know. It is for photographers based in New York State, anywhere in New York State. The upcoming deadline is on December 19th, and they award 10 fellowships. Each fellow receives $1,000, and I think, as Juanita said, the fellows receive, they're a part of an exhibition, and they get to be in a Nueva Luz publication. Mm-hmm. They also receive some professional development support, and of course, networking opportunities.
So another residency, or another way that Foco engages photographers of color in the state of New York, is through their Media Works in Progress fund by the letter SWIP. The deadline is January 11, 2021, so I encourage you to apply. The link to access this application is on the Foco website. And this is a residency that for photographers that expand their practice using media technologies, digital work, video, new media. I'm trying to read this, but this is actually on my, I can't read I have the bar on top of the text, but what I wanted to say is that this application is an extension to media work, video, sound, in addition to photography. So please check out this opportunity. And for more information, you can contact grants@enfoco.org. Without delaying our presentation, I'm going to move quickly to some of the links for more information about Enfoco, the traveling exhibitions, the programs Nueva Luz, and the fellowship. So these are links. I can include this later on the chat.
So this exhibition, Dos Mundos Reconstructing Narratives, is originally inspired from an earlier iteration of Dos Mundos featuring Puerto Rican artists from the island and in New York. as Foco has evolved, Juanita and I approached this theme, you know, from a 2019-2020 perspective. So we're featuring really diverse artists of color, and we wanted to focus on these stories that aren't necessarily the stories that are like on the fringe of our attention, that we're not necessarily thinking about every day. And so today we are, and Juanita can show some of the images, we're really grateful to have Erika Morillo with us, whose work we're looking at right now, as well as, and I should say, so we asked the artist, and Antonio Pulgarin, we asked the artist to include 3 additional images that weren't in the show. And we're also featuring, and then Aaron Turner's work, and we're also featuring the 3 works that are in the exhibition. We just wanted to have a little bit more of an expansive conversation today. And these works are related to or belonging to the same series of work that we're showing. So to kind of just jump into the questions, part of the reason why we wanted to speak to you, Aaron, Erika, and Antonio all together is that we did see that you have some things in common. Each of you are, I would say, complicating these ideas of like there being any like monolithic identity. So whether that's with your work, Aaron, you're challenging notions of like a monolithic Blackness, or with your work, Antonio, thinking about masculinity, or with your work, Erika, and complicating what womanhood or motherhood looks like. So I'd like to jump in and just ask each of you to speak about how has identity informed your work?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by saying something. It's funny because when I was exhibiting this work in Portland in December, I had a solo show there at Blue Sky Gallery, and we had an artist talk, and someone asked me if me being Dominican or if me being, you know, a woman of color has anything to do with this work. And I said, you know, not really. It's really not about that. You know, it's about something else. Like it's really about motherhood, you know, besides identity. But actually, I think the question at that moment caught me off guard because I really hadn't looked at my work from that lens. And just as I have been, you know, working with a photo book that I did of this work and kind of like understanding how very little female Caribbean voices are in photo books at the moment or in publishing photography work in printed matter, I started to understand that the work, although the concept itself maybe does not have to do with me being a woman of color, putting the work out there, which is also part of, you know, being an artist and being in conversation, has everything to do with that. And it's a very crucial part, I think, of my practice at the moment. You know, I'm very invested in taking an intent look at my experiences. And I think in the Caribbean, we have a problematic relationship with examining our experience, especially in the context of, you know, photography or motherhood, you know, challenging these notions of family, that family is sacred, and all these things, you know, that family is the pillar, or that we're supposed to be, you know, all the time happy, or, you know. So I think in my work, identity plays in that way, in the fact that I am committed to trying to expand that dialogue in the Caribbean and expand the dialogue on motherhood, and also challenge our very kind of traditional notions of what family is and how it should be experienced.
For me, I think identity plays a very crucial role in my work. To build a little bit on what Erika said, for me, it's learning this in my practice, that my existence is a rebellious call, you know, that me existing as a Latinx queer individual, the term, even embracing the term Latinx, which is still something that's in our communities in contention, right? You have traditionalists that are very much against the X in a term that, because they don't want to understand, because a lot of their mentalities and their identity, their ideologies are built on sort of these archaic principles of identity and masculinity and like what is expected from our community and us as a culture. Um, so the term X, you know, the term Latinx, which is used to be inclusive of those from the queer spectrum. It's interesting that there's so much contention to the term. There's also a historical component to that, but I haven't seen anyone in our community come up with a better term. So, but it's interesting to see uh, how people fight against in our community against a term that's supposed to sort of bring us closer together. So I think a lot of my work, I'm thinking about sort of dissecting these older ideologies that I grew up with. Not to say that I have a negative standpoint on everything Latinx culture. It's just there's certain perspectives that I feel like are outdated, and I look at machismo culture in particular, and that's really what this particular body of work, Fragments of the Masculine, really hones in on, is my relationship with these men that I only really knew through archival imagery. They happen to be my uncle, and my biological father. The project eventually evolved into sort of a second chapter where I talked about my relationship with my stepfather, who's Dominican, and I have ties to Dominican culture through him, and sort of this idea of displacement, right? Like being someone who's Latinx and queer, growing up in the States, but having ties to Colombian cultures, and but growing up traveling mostly to the Dominican Republic when I was a young kid, and even in my early adult years, like knowing that I'm traveling there and feeling like an outsider and an insider, because identifying with Latino culture, but also feeling like this is a culture that I wasn't too familiar with. I mean, for example, I always look back to the stories, like the first time I went to DR, you know, I grew up with the Colombian version of arepa, which is like a corn cake with cheese and salt. It's a very salty dish in Colombia, the way Colombia makes it. And then I went to DR, and like, you know, I was first time as a kid, I'm getting used to the foods, the taste, the smells, just, you know, la cultura. And my dad was like, all right, like as a way to like make me happy, he was like, we have arepa for you today. And I was so excited. And then they bring out this thing that looks like a cake. And they were like, here's arepa, here's the arepa. And I was like, that's not arepa. He's like, yeah, this is our version of arepa. And it was sweet. And I was like, oh. And like, it's a little moment like that, but sort of looking at the threads that bind us together, and the things that also make us culturally different and rich in so many ways. So I take those experiences, and I think that really informs my work, is coming from these different places. And I think as being Latinx and being queer, it's like they feel like two contradicting perspectives that, at least I always felt like they felt like two contradicting perspectives that weren't meant to coexist. That's how I always felt growing up, and sort of resolving that through this archive and making this work was really something that started out as therapeutic and was, you know, really more about me and my identity. And I realized as the process went further, that it was really about sort of speaking on identity and a culture that's been prominent within our communities. And you know, and there's people of color that resonate with this work. I've gotten messages from people all over the world that resonate with the theme of this work. People of color from all over the world. So that's been really great. Because I'm not going to sit here and say that I made the work to change the world. You know, I'm not going to spin you some narrative like that. It was very much, it came from a narcissistic place of wanting to you know, deal with something in a therapeutic means. And for me, art creating art is therapeutic, and but at the end of the process, I saw that it could serve a greater good, you know, in terms of speaking on things. Like if I could share my story, that it could resonate with others. So I'm happy that it has. But it was a process. But yes, my work is very much centered on the notions of identity and the complexities of identity and the different layers that make identity up. So.
And Erin, one thing Antonio brought up was working with the archive and knowing people through the archive. And I think of your work and the archival imagery that you work with, and identity kind of being like a conceptual foundation of your work. So I'd love to hear you speak to how you think about identity in your work.
Yeah, it's a complicated answer because there's so many layers. To add to what Erika and Antonio just expressed, you know, I know when you all are probably working in the studio and creating your work, it's just all these ideas just spinning in your head, and you know, it's a lifelong thing. It never really stops. So identity plays an important role in my work. But when I first started out in photography, I necessarily didn't have the understanding of representation or anything like that. It was just, you take this first class, they present this history of photo book, and you just kind of go with it. And it wasn't until after I finished undergrad that I started being exposed to photographers like Gordon Parks and Roy De Carava. And then I started to move throughout the other various diasporas of people of color. And then it just shows you how they were left out of the narrative. And then things like that is what keeps me in the past and keep me engaged with the archive, because even everything that we're dealing with today, there's some version of that has happened in the past. And I'm always looking for those signifiers in the past, because I'm like, something was missed there. Something was overlooked. Not enough attention was paid to this archive or this representational historical event through imagery, because it's repeated itself many times over. So that's how I engage with identity and representation in my work. My work, Black Alchemy, is kind of like a lens. It's kind of like a vehicle to interpret things as an artist, working in the studio with my own thoughts, navigating my own childhood, navigating my own life experiences, and then how that kind of crosses paths with everyone else that I come into contact with along the way. So it's a long, lifelong, continuing conversation about identity, because you know, on a personal level, I love geometric abstraction. I love to follow light. I love beautiful landscapes, but I can't escape out of my skin. I cannot forget my heritage. I can't forget my parents. I can't forget my grandparents and the things that they shared with me, the things that they've lived through. And so that's why the archive continues to creep into my work, because I've tried to just go in the studio and photograph, you know, a beautifully lit object without putting an image of Martin Luther King in there. And I just can't do it. It won't leave me alone. So that's why my work looks the way that it does and how identity plays into it.
So I'm going to go back to, maybe I'm just going to start with Erika with this question about symbolism in your work. So what are some of the symbols you use in your work, Erika? And I can be more specific, but I'm just going to let you answer that first part, and I may do some follow-up questions.
Okay, first of all, I want to apologize because you will hear like bang, really loud banging because they're doing construction. So you might hear some of that in a little bit. It's weird, and I always love being in conversation with other artists and seeing how they create. Like, for example, with Antonio and Aaron, I'm really fascinated about the work that comes from looking at an archive and then thinking conceptually how you can interpret it. And but when I was making this work, which is kind of like my first cohesive and big project, it was like the complete opposite. I never had an idea a priori that I was carrying out, it was only when I started to look at the images that I saw kind of like connecting thread. In documenting my son, this work was a lot about really being present in the moment as a single mom. You know, I was conflicted with becoming a single mother so young. So I think photography allowed me to be present in that experience and investigate it. And then after I had amassed years of photographs, I started to see connecting threads. One of them was water, and was how water in the work came to serve as this kind of either reflecting agent or veil. So for example here, how in this image, you know, he's like in another kind of world. For me, like a lot of this has to do with entering a dreamscape. So, you know, in my work, water serves as this kind of like portal to enter a dreamscape, or in the other image that is there, the past dissolves, where there's like a curtain of water in another reality that my son is about to enter. I also see that as a kind of visual element that I use in my work to express my feelings. Another thing is gesture. So when I was editing the work, of course, I had many portraits of my son, but the ones that I chose for this work, most of the ones that I gravitated towards are the ones where he's kind of like in this suspended state. He's either with his eyes closed or his eyes are veiled. And for me, this sort of gesture, this suspension, I wanted to use it as a way to represent me wanting him to stay a child and not realize part of the baggage that I bring to my mothering through my family history. There's a lot of trauma in my family, which I speak of in my other work, in my photo books and in other projects. But for example, there was a femicide in my family, and sexual abuse, and a lot of things that are very heavy that I've been trying to grapple with in my work. And through sort of veiling his gaze, it is me talking about my own fear, I find. And of course, this is not something that I created intentionally. It is only after I look at the work after that I realize what my intention is. So that's something very integral to my practice as well. Kind of like photography is a way to understand what I'm feeling before I'm conscious of it. I understand that after, when I examine my work and my images. And also shadows. These particular pictures don't have like such a high usage of shadows as the other ones in the work. But there are other photos of this body of work where shadows are very present. And for me, I wanted shadows to come, well, I guess in this one, yes, but I wanted to come and talk about polarities and how, as human beings, I don't believe in the notion of a human being being completely wholesome. I think we're all dealing with either a darkness or a history or something that is at odds, at a duality. And to me, motherhood itself was that kind of duality of like, and I had issues with that because I wanted to be like happy mom all the time, and oh, motherhood is the greatest thing that happened to me. But oftentimes it was very tumultuous, and you know, so with the shadows in the work, I'm also trying to express that other part.
Thank you, Erika. I'm making a note, as you mentioned, the shadows, the reflection of the water. I'm, you know, just maybe to kind of, as a connecting thread for these works, umbral, can you talk a little bit about the symbolism on that word?
Yeah, umbral, it came from what I was speaking about before, this idea of like suspension, but you know, umbral, which translates to threshold, is in between space. And for me, that in between space in the work is him transitioning from childhood to adolescence, and what that represents in terms of his innocence, what he knows about me, about his own history. So there's that in that transition you know, kind of like moving from one age to another. But there's also umbral between, you know, reality as we know it and a dreamscape. So to me, in my work, I like to make images that, you know, feel could be part of dreams, that could be like what you see when you're in the haze of a dream. So that umbral represents that for me. And lastly, there are many meanings that I associate with it, but another one was that I think as a person, I was really, as a kind of alchemy, was really transformed by the experience of motherhood, both in its hardship and its wonder. So to me, umbral really represents also what motherhood has been in my life and also in my work. I think I became an artist after I had my kid, which is really paradoxical because I thought when I became a single mom, oh, I'm not gonna be able to do, you know, anything significant now. Now I'm gonna be only a mother. And it was through that kind of like that I started to create. And yeah.
Thank you, Erika. That was great. I want to pose the same question with Antonio, but I'm going to tailor that to the work. And Antonio, like with Erika, right? The symbolism, and it's interesting because there's a lot of symbolism in the works of the three of you. While with Erika is connected to reality versus fantasy, reflections, its hard edges. I want to ask Antonio about symbolism in your work, and just tell me more about symbolism and the archival aspect of the work, and how do you see that plays out?
I think throughout my work, I use symbolism in various different different ways. With this image, it's which looks more sculptural than anything. It was sort of created as a sculpture. It's the hat is the military cap of my my uncle's military cap from Colombia that was left to me. The jacket is my jacket, sort of a jacket for me, wearing a leather biker jacket in in the village here in New York City. It's just like there's this queer symbolism to that. Just in the history of sort of like the leather scene in but it's also here in like in my perspective there's a connection there. So it's about really connecting my connections to my uncle, who for me is very representative of Colombian culture, and then tying in my connections to queer histories. I think also symbolically, I'm also looking at how we consume imagery. And I've been thinking about this more in this quarantine year. It's interesting. I'm in a show that's about photography, but the term photography or photographer is not something that I identify with as much nowadays. Photography itself will always be an important component of my process and my practice, but I feel like I've sort of moved away from, and there's nothing wrong with the conventional approach to photography. I don't want it to be misconstrued. I just see myself moving in different directions. Because I think about how I consumed photography as a kid, and I had really sort of this big epiphany moment this year where I was, you get trained in a way when you're showing your photographs and your artwork to want to frame everything. And I thought back to the way that I consumed imagery as a kid, and imagery was never something I consumed via the frame. It was always something that was taped to the fridge or taped to a religious statue or to a mirror, adhered in some way to another surface, but never within the context of this frame. Whenever you did see the frame, a framed image, it was a very sort of like special moment. The way that image was treated, the fact that there was enough money to put it in a frame, or there was enough thought to put something in a frame. And I really, I realized, why have I been framing my work for so long, when it's, so I'm thinking about the different ways that I consume photography or have consumed photography, the ways that I then sort of present it to an audience. A lot of these photographic collages are now being presented in different capacities. In this exhibition alone, there are two prints on aluminum.
Oh, I didn't to that. So.
Yeah, and I believe, it's these two that are printed in aluminum, and I'm playing with sizes in terms of how you interact with the images. There's only one framed piece representing me in this exhibition, which is this one, and it made sense because of the care and the treatment of how fragile this archival image was. So I'm really thinking about those choices when presenting the work. So there's a lot of symbolism, and of course there's symbolism in the color palette. I utilize in this particular project, the colors of the Colombian flag come through in different tones or shades. So you'll see yellow, red, and blue throughout the project, and that's very common. And then I'm playing with things like, wallpaper vinyls and installation, using that method of visual language. I'm also printing on, lately I've been printing now on wooden panels, on marble, and really kind of playing with these ideas of how we visually consume photographic works, or just photography and collage works in general. So there's a lot of symbolism in my work that goes beyond the cultural symbolism, which is there, it's present, but I'm thinking about sort of the medium as well.
Thank you, Antonio. We'll talk a little bit about the process, but before we move into that, I just want to ask this question to Aaron also, and the way I'm gonna probably tailor it to him is like, what are some of the symbols you use in your work? And in particular, I'm going to go quickly through the images, Aaron, while you answer that. But I also see, some shadow casting, layering, historical references. I'm going to let you answer the question, but the symbolism in your work, the symbols in your work.
Yeah, I just want to say I love that Antonio mentioned, how images are consumed and outside of the frame, and how Erika brought up alchemy and the duality between these ways of existing. It's just like, I'm thinking of similar things, but in terms of symbols in my work and references, I'm sort of always in between these two spaces of trying to understand the trajectory of Black abstract artists from the 1970s and the 1960s, and how the work that they were making were excluded from the narrative, and kind of seen as second rate. But then those same artists are receiving a lot of notoriety now, and at the same time, they're my contemporaries as well. They're still making work. They never deviated from abstraction. So being motivated from that, like speaking specifically about the freedom study number 1 and freedom study number 2 images, it's, you have these, in my image, I use these Xerox prints of Martin Luther King, JFK, and Jesus, I think, we know that that's not the true depiction of Jesus. We don't really know what that depiction is, but it's this sort of this stand-in or image that people believed in from a certain time period, and still to today. I grew up seeing that image in my grandparents' house. Grew up seeing that image at the church I went to, or different churches I would visit growing up in the Arkansas Delta. And so, but this piece is in direct conversation with the painting from the artist Kerry James Marshall. And it's from this series of works he calls mementos. And it's in conversation with this piece titled "We Mourn Our Loss," number 1, from 1997. And he goes on years after that to make, I think eventually 8 of these memento pieces. And sort of what it's dealing with is like, he was looking at commemorative banners that were present in African-American households, like in the late 1960s and 1970s, following these assassinations of people like Martin Luther King and JFK. I mean, the images are on plates, posters, handouts. I remember seeing MLK church fans growing up, bookmarkings for Bibles and all that kind of stuff with historical figures on them. And so it's that sort of comes out of like the three individuals pictured in these Xerox prints. You know, they all had this belief of serving the disenfranchised, and it fuels their status because they all are martyrs to their specific cause. And so there's multiple layers of interpretations, meanings, and values to that, of the nature of commemoration. And my image is trying to decontextualize or transform that, just add to the conversation. And so it's like, and then also going back to abstraction and then different lines and stuff that you see, that's kind of like the visual pleasure of the geometric forms. And, you know, one image is more decorative than the other. So like Antonio was talking about the frames, like, you know, I would grow up seeing these images in frames or adorned in a poster. You know, there may be glitter or like gold leaf and things like that, where I'm just taking these images and pinning them to a wall on Xerox paper from a copier. But the way that I decorate the frame is through geometric abstraction or some form of abstraction of light. And so to sort of round out the symbology in that, it just takes another look. It's not simply, you know, looking at these horrific events themselves or the loss of life, you know, political implications or historical impacts, the ideal of a martyr or being martyred. But it's an act of remembering. It's an act of continuing remembering. How do we remember things from childhood? How do we commemorate? And also the figures from Freedom Study 1 and 2, there's different combinations and versions of that depending on the culture you grow up in or the culture you're from. It's going to look different in an Irish household. It's going to look different in a Dominican household. It's going to look different in a Native American household. So it's kind of like a puzzle where you can interchange and pull out different pieces. Kerry James Marshall piece doesn't include Jesus. His includes Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy. So that's his version. I didn't put Robert F. Kennedy in my work because I just didn't grow up hearing about Robert F. Kennedy. Mine were more so the figures that are present in my work. So that's a little bit of you know, how I deal with symbology in my work, speaking from that diptych, so to speak. Yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of, these questions connect, and some of you already delve into this territory by speaking. So I'm just gonna go back to Erika's images because I wanna touch a little bit on, again, another element that I see that relates, but relates differently. And it's about the way you manipulate your photo, meaning the way the object into itself, that photography, the layers that I see. And some of these layers are physical layers that have been photographed, as the way you frame your photos, your composition, the way that, and you know, it's interesting that all three of you use the word archival and archives, which I find fascinating because I was thinking, oh yeah, and it's funny, you know, we don't think as this accumulation of images and memories as you just archive and memories in your work, all three of you. So Erika, I want to hear more about the way your photos are manipulated. I'm thinking of the way the images are framed, the sourcing, the reflections, what seems to be real and what seems to be more like fantasy. So I'm going to start with Erika, then move to Antonio, and then to Aaron.
Well, with this, like, when I photograph, one of the things that I really enjoy is being really, really close to the subject. Like, I always photograph like with a fixed lens or with my phone or whatever I have at hand, but I like to be very close. And, you know, sometimes I don't look at the subject directly, but through something else or something in the middle or through water. Let me see. I'm trying to see if I have one of my books here that I can show you an image, but I have like a couple of images of my son where, you know, I'm seeing him through a window or through a car or through something else. And I really enjoy in the image to have different layers. This one's particularly here are, the frame is not as chaotic. These are actually from the work, the ones that are like cleanest, but I think I'm very influenced by New York City street photographers, you know, how, you know, this energy in the frame, which is why I like to shoot more like wider images to kind of see how the frame can be dynamic and have different elements to it. Let me show you really quickly here. I have this dummy that I did of my work umbral. In this image I have here, which is like my kid, you know, the forefront is the bloom and the flower, and he's kind of like in the back, like in the framing of my work. I really like this element of having other things complicate the frame. Or for example, this one, where it's a self-portrait, but he's also there. And I like this kind of like dynamic aspect in the image where you're not looking at something concretely, although I do have images like that. But this, I think this particular one is what I was alluding to in terms of like the energy of like street photography. Let me see if you guys can see it here. So this is one of the images of my kid in Coney Island. And when I print this image big, you know, I'm just fascinated by all the people in the back. There's a lady that is pregnant. There's the Ferris wheel. There's like a mom or a grandmom with 3 kids and like running to one side. And like this sort of like dynamic aspect is something I enjoy in photography. To kind of like zoom in with my feet to get close. And right now I'm trying to, in my present projects, I'm trying to divert from that because I'm not shooting as much and working more from archive. And how can you find that dynamic aspect in the imagery when you're not, you know, shooting? So for example, with Antonio's work, in his image that is ripped, or, you know, in Aaron's work where you have this other layer of like dust underneath, it's very inspiring to see how you can layer an image, not with framing, but with materials as well. So yeah.
Erica, in thinking about the form, can you also, you provide your viewer with a really intimate experience with the artist book. Can you talk about your decision to present your work in artist books?
Yeah, let me see. I have here the book I did for Umbral. So let me just show you really quickly. Like, as I mentioned, for me, I've always been very drawn to books, and I think it had to do a lot with my work. I work at the International Center of Photography in the library, and we see books and books and books, and like the way you conceive of a project or an image within a book is completely different than how you see it in a wall or how you perceive it in one single image. So to me, there has been a shift in my work in trying to get at a reader's experience. So for Umbral, what I did was that I did this artist book that is shaped as a kind of letter. It's a handmade pouch, and it's a continuation of previous work where I did an photo book related to my father. Like my father was killed in a dictatorship in Dominican Republic, and his body was never found. And in this previous work, what I did was that I utilized found images to come and fill in the gaps in my memory about my father, and I mixed that with the archive, with like my family archive. So that was like a way of approaching a history from books that really touched me. And with doing Umbral, I wanted to do a kind of letter too, but different. I wanted to honor this idea of the family album. So when you open it like this, you know, here in the back you have I wanted it to have the kind of feeling of the family album, you know, how the photos are fastened in the corners. And then the book has a poem that I wrote to my son, which starts in the cover, and it continues throughout the book as you page through it. And I just really wanted it to feel like postcard size, like a letter, like something intimate that you receive in the mail. This is one of the images from the book, for example. And then the poem kind of unfolds.
Oh, wow.
Images like this. And then there are like, I really wanted the images in the book to be in conversation. So for example, this is one of the spreads I like the most, which on one side is the image we've seen of my son and a kind of self-portrait with him, but I've always found this image kind of a bit morbid. And then this dead bird that I found in the street, and kind of like the fragility in motherhood as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the book starts this way, and then when you flip it, you have the same experience, but with the photo edition backwards and the poem also read backwards. So the book itself is a kind of mirror with like two interpretations, and it's just a different way of looking at the work. And to me, there is a political element to making work in printed matter, getting your work to more hands, creating a document of your voice that could be disseminated. And there aren't a lot of women doing photo books or, you know, photography focused on family in the Caribbean. And for me, I just want to expand that. And that's my interest in making books.
So this time I'm thinking of the formal devices that you use to communicate your ideas. And, you know, you mentioned archive, you mentioned family, the importance of that, but also I'm thinking of that, that textured feeling that I have. Like I literally feel the paper and how the work was composed in your work. So please share that with us, and let me know if you want me to share the screen and go over the images, or if we can speak just like this.
A lot of my process is it begins with sort of scanning the archive, and then what I like to do is print it on a lot of various surfaces. So I make a lot of reproduction prints.
I'm gonna pull the
and so in the process of making those reproduction prints, there's a lot of experimenting. There's a lot of ripping and tearing and layering. Sometimes I'll make larger collages, and by the time that I recontextualize it through the camera or through a digital lens, I find that I hone in on a part that feels like this is the strongest part. Essentially what I do is I crop. A lot of the times you'll see me crop the what is like a larger collage into the final composition, and that just has to do with a feeling I get once I'm looking through the viewfinder, what I feel works, and what feels strongest, and sort of it's the same approach that I would take when composing an image on the field when I did documentary work. My earlier work it's the same approach. It's just looking at it through a different I don't want to say lenses, but anyway, that sounds so punny. But anyway, but it is through a different perspective now. And so a lot of it is just really just experimenting and seeing what works. Really looking, I did prior to starting this work, looking at the pictures generation and looking at that era of like of art making and looking at sort of how images were layered and composed. And then from there, you know, I try not to look at a lot of work that's being made now. I like to just kind of go in there into my process kind of blindly and just play, which I felt like prior to this project, I didn't really get a chance to do that. I think it had been a while since I just had an opportunity to just play around conceptually, because I think I got caught up in this very, you know, it's being addressed now in our social political climate, but like prior to this, it got lost in this very sort of toxic cycle of like feeling like I couldn't find my place in the documentary journalistic photo world, right? You know, not getting the gigs, constantly seeing my white rays thing, you know, where they're going to foreign countries, photographing narratives that don't belong to them, getting paid for it, and I just felt very disheartened, you know, and it made me sort of like drift away from documentary and portraiture work, and I had this archive sitting there, and I had a need to do something with it for a long time, and I sort of just took the opportunity to do so and to kind of reinvent and re-examine what my practice would look like. So a lot of these collages are an experiment in a new process, for me, and I'm working on a new body of work now that I'm like incredibly excited by, and there's been an evolution in how I'm approaching these collages and the patterns and the textiles that I use, and
Mhm.
so it's exciting I look at these images now, and they very much represent the foundation of what my work is becoming now, but it's still a nod to my love for photography and the way that I compose my work. It's I took no different approach. I mean, you see in this installation, these are that's a portrait of my stepfather, of his back, and that's a portrait of me in like a leather harness. That's my back. So it's like I'm not shifting away from photography by any means, but it's no longer the only element of my work. Um, so yeah, so I think that but it all started with these photographic collages, and just playing around. The patterns came into play a little later, where I would randomly. I mean, I'm just like a lover of like just floral patterns and things of that nature, and just textiles, and I would just buy like. It started with me buying like all these random wrapping papers that I knew I would never use. I'm just like so random. I go to Paper Source in the city or stuff like that, and like, and then one of this was actually wrapping paper, and it reminded me of the emeralds in Colombia, the yellow, of course, in the flag, and it also reminded me of the tapestries that my mom would use on the tables at home when I was growing up, like um, those table mats that she would have on this on the living room, and I just was really sort of like it took me back to memories of home,
Mhm.
and I realized, oh, like this utilizing this pattern makes sense, and I just started collecting more patterns, and now my apartment's just filled with an assortment of patterns and fox leather prints, and oh my god, it's a whole mess. I have to figure out a way to to organize it, but it just was an experiment to see if that pattern and would fit with this narrative, and it just slowly but surely started to come together.
So Antonio, maybe I neglected to mention this, but the series of works that we're looking at are called fragments of masculinity, right?
Fragments of the masculine, yeah.
Fragments of the masculine. Thank you so much. And somehow that title relates to that fragmented and yet kind of way where things are layered and collaged together digitally. So was that something that was intentional, that the title came, was that first, or that came after you look at the work overall and then you saw that it was all these layering, that it was metaphorical and literal in the work that you're doing?
That came after looking at the works. Like to be honest, when I was making this work, it was like piece by piece. I didn't really know what everything was going to look like because this was all new territory for me. It wasn't until I started sort of making smaller work prints and looking at everything as a whole that I was like, wow. And I entertained a few titles, but Fragments of the Masculine kind of like felt, there was something poetic about it. There was something that, yes, of course, spoke to the physical nature of the works, but really talked about dissecting these different elements that make up machismo culture and masculinity, and really sort of, and then there was, in some of the other works, there's a use of like dialect, terminology in Spanish, in the Spanish language, that is incorporated into the works. And I really wanted to, incorporate the aspect that I'm bilingual, that I come from a bilingual family, bilingual culture, because I think that that's something that very much makes up my identity, and it's an important aspect of my identity. And like, I wanted to incorporate that, because I would shy away from Spanish titles earlier in my career, and I think now I've learned to embrace it, and like, I'm not going to translate something for you if I don't feel like it. It's look it up. That may be harsh, but I am living my truth as a Latinx individual, and but that took a lot of sort of resolving, and I think that through this work I was able to sort of really connect with my inner cultura, my roots, my connections to my roots, because that was always sort of something that was very complex for me. I felt as a young age I didn't belong, because I had these other feelings of like, what does it mean to be a gay man in this culture, and like, can I even belong? So it's taken me a while to embrace just even saying I am a Latinx queer individual. So that has been a process, and I think through this work I was able to really sort of resolve a lot of that. It was very therapeutic. I'll say that.
Yeah. Thanks, Antonio. I'm going to move with this question and tailor it to Aaron. And Aaron, if you can speak about the formal devices that you use to communicate your ideas in your work, and take it away.
Yeah, I use a lot of different formal devices in my work. I think one of the most important is the 4x5 view camera, because I wouldn't have been able to imagine the spaces that I've created through Black alchemy without it. And ever since I was introduced to the 4x5 camera, like, as an undergraduate, maybe my second or third year through my degree, I haven't put it down. I have a genuine love for that camera. I love the process of setting up the camera. I love looking through the camera. I love the process of developing film afterwards. I love the quality of film. I love to scan the film, but I also like to take it in the dark room and enlarge it onto photo paper, and explore different textures through that. But I also like to explore materials, kind of like how Antonio was talking about, going around collecting all these different papers and patterns and textiles. In my studio now, there's like black gesso everywhere, linen tape, black suede, black backdrops, plain black paper. There was core board, masonite, wood, different types of paint, acrylic paint, oil stick, and it's all in this monochrome color palette of like black and white. And then, when you're exposing, when I'm exposing the film, you can get the silvers and the grays. And when I mix the paints or mix the patterns, or the light interacts with multiple colors in the same space, you start to get these different shades and hues of things. So I'm always trying to work on the sort of the opposite ends of the spectrums. Like this photograph, that photograph of the lynching, making that photograph, making this photograph in a pitch black room, with just that light box, and metering it. And it was like, because the camera sees different than we do. And I'm like, oh my goodness, is this thing going to come out? And that's the alchemaic side of it, because I didn't really know how this image was going to come out before I developed it. And then I could see the negative and all that good stuff. But, you know, this image just started as a vision I had in my mind as I was trying to deal with using photography to examine the absence of photographic elements. Because I traced this lynching image, and it's a whole backstory to it. And I was looking at the artist Melvin Edwards and his lynching fragments around this time too.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also trying to experiment with other mediums at the time. So drawing and tracing and charcoal and oil stick. But then those materials would always end up in front of the camera. So that's a little bit about how I use formal devices and approaches in my work. And in some of the material choices, I'm interested in the ideal of reflecting. So just like I was talking about in all these archives, how the archive allows us to look back and reflect. Even in this image here, Untitled Self, a literal reflection of myself. I show up in the work. And then you look in the corner, there's the Sidney Poitier work.
I'm going to see the arrow here.
Mm-hmm. And then, you know, that's often how my studio looks. You know, paper is just everywhere. I'm making Xerox prints. I'm making inkjet prints. I'm making darkroom prints. And then I'm taking that and bringing it back in front of the camera. So that's a little bit how my studio operates and how I think of things. Like that background there, that's black felt. And so the light is going to absorb differently. It's going to reflect differently. It's going to act differently than it would be if it was just paper or suede or satin or silk material. So I'm very much interested in the materials formally and drawing on certain materials formally, just as much as I am the archive. So,
Aaron, is this photographic paper or this is Xerox paper? It looks
Xerox paper, and that's a way of like working fast. You know, I have these ideas, and I'm like, I got to make that image now. And a lot of what I was doing when I was making these pictures in 2018 is, and I can tell the backstory on this one real quick. But this image is Drew King, and I was Googling and looking through archives for African American men in the Ivy League, just to see how they were depicted and represented. And Drew King reminded me of myself. It reminded me of several friends that I have had, reminded me of different mentors. He reminds me of my brothers, my cousins, all these different things. But the specific backstory is this crop photo of Drew King is it's a crop, because if I had the link, I would put it in the chat. But the larger picture is from like a yearbook, and Drew King is in the Glee Club at Harvard at this time in like 1941, 1943. And he's the only Black member. And so with that being said, and with that being the case, his presence in the Glee Club, these Ivy League Glee clubs used to travel throughout the South, and they had to contend with the fact that there was segregation at the point. And so due to Drew King being in the Glee Club, they had to desegregate because they wanted to enjoy this entertainment. They had to accept Drew King when they traveled through the South. So he kind of sort of, in a way, had made them contend with desegregating these venues when they traveled throughout the segregated South in the 1940s. So sometimes I react to the found image because it reminds me of people personally that I interact with. And then I go and find the backstory and see how I can learn from that and how other people can learn from that. And just a clarification on Drew King, if you want to look up Drew King, is D-R-E-W, not D-R-U-E. that's a clerical error on my end, just in case somebody tries to look it up and they're like, I don't know, this is not true. But it's DREU. So I've changed the title because, again, I remembered his name, but I forgot how he spelled it. And then I found it again, recontextualized it, corrected the title, and it's just all a part of the process. So I just want to make that note.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Aaron. I want to pass the mic to Stephanie, just to kind of piggyback of some of the things that, how with this connecting thread of your works with archives, memory, with layers, and the process. Stephanie, I'm going to move in to you now, and let me know if you want me to continue to share the screen or if you want me to stop sharing.
Yeah, why don't we stick with Erin's work for the moment? So for this last question, I'd like for each of you to talk about the ideals or models that your work considers. And so Erin, I was reading back through your statement that you have in Nueva Luz, and you mentioned this article. It's called "Why It's Not Enough to Say Black is Beautiful," and it's written by British Guyanese abstract painter Frank Bowling. And it states that the traditional Black aesthetic is pragmatic, uncluttered, direct, hinging on secrecy and disguise. And I know also, actually, maybe we can go to the work with MacArthur Binion. Juanita.
Absolutely.
That, another abstract painter, MacArthur Binion, has also influenced you. So I'd love to, in thinking about like the models or role models that our work considers, I would love to hear you talk about how Black abstract painters and their ideas have influenced you.
Yes, and I'm gonna try to keep it brief because I have a lot to say about this topic. I'm actually gonna post a link in the chat. And it's an article, a recent article within the last 2 days about Frank Bowling. He wrote this article way back he wrote that article, "It's Not Enough to Say Black is Beautiful," back in 1971. And so this is artist coming right off of the cuff of the Black arts movement, kind of right in the middle of it as it was sort of ending. And the work that "It's Not Enough to Say Black is Beautiful" is detailing 5 Black artists that for a show that he curated. They're all male artists and they're working within abstraction. And so part of the question in my work was like, if someone walks into a gallery and sees my work, will they ask, is this a Black artist? Will they assume that this is a Black artist? Or will they just say, who is the artist? Or what's this work about? And so a lot of what those artists were dealing with, and a lot of what that 1971 article was dealing with, was this refusal of certain Black artists to adhere to didactic work, sort of a figurative Black aesthetic. They were color filled. They are and were color filled because some of them are deceased now, but color filled